Well, this movie had some perfect timing. Talk about the most fitting movie to watch while quarantined, right? The platform takes place in a prison-like facility called the Pit, where some people are there voluntarily so they can receive something in exchange, while others are held there as prisoners as an alternative to jail. The pit contains multiple floors, with 2 people per floor, and every day a platform descends with food for the inhabitants to eat quickly before descending to the next floor. Those on the top get to feast, while the ones on the bottom aren't so lucky. And that's something one of the inhabitants, a man named Goring, looks to soon change. Truthfully, this movie was not even on my radar until I happened to open up Netflix over the weekend and caught a preview of it. I looked it up and it turned out it had a good run at festivals last year, most notably Fantastic Fest and TIFF. Netflix picked it up shortly after, and the timing of this release, I don't know if it was just coincidence that it was always set for a March 20th release, or if Netflix moved the date up given the current state of affairs. But given that most of the world is on quarantine right now due to the coronavirus, this really is an appropriate movie to watch. So let's discuss. This movie is like if you took Saw and mixed it with a Bong Joon-ho movie like Parasite or Snowpiercer. You have 2 people in a room struggling to survive, and with this platform always starting from the top, everyone who's on the first 40 to 50 levels has no problem surviving. There's always enough food for them to eat, and what they do is, because there's so much food left over, they'll even take more than what they really need. But the people at the bottom aren't so lucky, and they'll resort to some extreme measures because there's barely any food left by the time it gets down to them, or there's nothing at all. So it's one big take on the class system, similar to what Parasite and Snowpiercer explored. If you're someone who struggles daily or is living paycheck to paycheck, you can easily relate to a lot of the people who are at the bottom levels. The idea that's presented is, if everyone only took exactly what they needed, there would be plenty of food left for everyone at all levels. Throughout the movie, people residing in the pit will at some points wake up and find themselves on a new floor. You can go for a month being on top and then suddenly get moved to the bottom, or vice versa. Or sometimes you can be moved somewhere in the middle with no rhyme or reason. And some people might always stay on the bottom, and some people might always stay on the top. And this shows, through horror elements, the extreme lengths some people will go through if they're always remaining on the bottom. That's where the Saw-like elements really come into play. There's a sense of claustrophobia maintained throughout this entire movie. Each scene takes place in this tiny room with only 2 people in the room, and when you're stuck with the same person all day, every day, the tension keeps building because you don't know what they're gonna do to one another. And there are scenes of brutal violence. A lot of it's too graphic to get into here, but some of the measures that some inhabitants take because their time in the pit begins to take its toll on them can be uncomfortable to watch. Though it doesn't drag any of these acts out. Like, I've seen movies depict brutal acts of violence and drag them out. But that doesn't happen here. Nothing goes on way longer than it needs to. But some of the events that do occur are unpleasant to watch all the same. I'd say this is also a movie that plays around with expectations. Even though it's always within closed quarters, it jumps around through multiple levels, so you get to see what it's like on the top as well as the bottom. But because everyone's in the pit for different reasons, you don't know what to expect when you meet these newer characters. Some might be pretty civil, and some might be psychotic, but even the civil ones might crack if you ask them to do something that's out of their normal routine. And while we're introduced to a lot of new characters, what's nice is a lot of them don't just feel like plot devices, they feel like fleshed out characters. There's a heavy psychological aspect to this, and we get to explore the mindset of many different characters, especially Goring's. His background and his motivations are established early on, and they're perfectly clear, so it's easy to sympathize with him, and it's easy to root for him as he tries to buck this unjust system. So that was great. There's a great message to this movie criticizing the class system, and it gets its point across a lot better than most other movies that try to provide social commentary. I just think it can be a little heavy-handed in its approach at times. There's a lot of on-the-nose dialogue at certain points, and it tends to take you out of the moment when that does happen. Movies like Snowpiercer and Parasite work because a lot of the commentary comes from characters' reactions and how they deal with something on an emotional level. At a certain point in this movie, though, the dialogue shifts its focus to the characters specifically saying how they want to send a message. Before that, I was piecing together for myself what represented what through the more naturalistic dialogue. It's like at a certain point, the movie just says, hey, this is the point we're trying to make, and we're going to explicitly remind you all throughout the remainder of this movie what that point is. Though, don't get me wrong, it is a really well-intentioned message, and I do agree with it. But for a movie that heavily explores characters' psyches, I think it could have just went for a subtler approach at times, rather than flat out handing it to the audience so they don't have to think. Because now I really feel like I'm watching a movie rather than something that's meant to feel real, if that makes sense. Like, it just feels like the characters are literally speaking to me. There's a balance you want to achieve when it comes to social commentary. You don't want it to be so subtle that it goes over audiences' heads, but if you make it too obvious, even if it's a good message, you run the risk of the conversations just not feeling natural. Like, it's forcing the message in, and I think this movie just leaned in that direction a number of times. Only other major issue I had was that there are a lot of dream sequences and a lot of hallucinations, and I think the movie can just get lost in those sequences at times. Most of them were fine, but some of them can go on for just a bit too long, and it's one of those things where if you stop paying attention for a minute, it can suddenly lose you. Now, I'm not against the movie playing around with blurring the lines between fantasy and reality, especially if that helps explore a character's psyche. Though, once again, there's a line you just don't want to cross, because if you get wrapped up in that sort of stuff, it just keeps the story from actually progressing. It doesn't happen all the time, and it doesn't make the movie unenjoyable, it's just noticeable enough. This was a nice surprise, especially considering I didn't know anything about it up until a few minutes before watching it. Its message may feel obvious, but it's very well intentioned, and the social commentary is very appropriate for these times. And on top of that, it's just an overall effective horror movie. It's tense, uncomfortable, suspenseful, and claustrophobic. The Platform gets an 8 out of 10. Is it like a new horror classic? No. But it brings up a lot of solid points that we can all relate to in some way and tells them through horror elements, so that was great. It's a really enjoyable movie, and so far one of Netflix's better releases this year. But let me know, did you see The Platform, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you find it creepy? Did you enjoy the social commentary? And what's one movie that takes place in confined quarters that you enjoyed? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, if you like what you see, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you next time.